Hello, church family. We greatly miss being with you, and I hope that you are all staying safe. On this Wednesday of Holy Week, I wanted to share with you some thoughts about suffering. One of my Lenten devotionals is called Bread and Wine. It's a collection of readings by a variety of authors, and Thomas Merton's reading about suffering seemed especially applicable right now, both because of COVID-19 and because we're rapidly approaching the cross and Good Friday. Merton starts with these words. The Christian must not only accept suffering, he must make it holy. Nothing so easily becomes unholy as suffering. Merely accepted, suffering does nothing for our souls except, perhaps, to harden them. Endurance alone is no consecration. True asceticism is not a mere cult of fortitude. We can deny ourselves rigorously for the wrong reason and end up pleasing ourselves mightily with our self-denial. Suffering is consecrated to God by faith, not by faith in suffering, but by faith in God. Some of us believe in the power and the value of suffering, but such a belief is an illusion. Suffering has no power and no value of its own. It is valuable only as a test of faith. What if our faith fails the test? Is it good to suffer then? What if we enter into suffering with a strong faith in suffering and then discover that suffering destroys us? To believe in suffering is pride, but to suffer, believing in God, is humility. For pride may tell us that we are strong enough to suffer, that suffering is good for us because we are good. Humility tells us that suffering is an evil which we must always expect to find in our lives because of the evil that is in ourselves. But faith also knows that the mercy of God is given to those who seek Him in suffering, and that by His grace we can overcome evil with good. Suffering then becomes good by accident, by the good that it enables us to receive more abundantly from the mercy of God. It does not make us good by itself, but it enables us to make ourselves better than we are. Thus, what we consecrate to God in suffering is not our suffering, but ourselves. As our world suffers right now, we can consider how we respond to that suffering. We are not here to evaluate the magnitude of our or someone else's suffering or to compare sufferings. But let us acknowledge suffering and evaluate our attitude toward it. Do you consider suffering to be good? If so, why? Do you stoically accept suffering? Do you turn your sufferings over to God and surrender? Suffering is not good in and of itself. And we must never call that which is evil, that which is opposite to the life of God, good. But we can find mercy in the midst of our sufferings as we seek God. So today, if you are stuck in your house, out of work or school, how is it that you can seek the face of God? If you're going out every day to an essential job, how can you let God overcome your suffering with good? If you're isolated and alone, if you're surrounded and overwhelmed by people, if you're missing loved ones, if you're missing your routine, how can you be transformed into the likeness of God through your sufferings? Merton and Holy Week have an answer for us, and that answer is through the sufferings of Jesus. I'm going to continue for a short section of what Merton continues to write. He says, "Only the sufferings of Christ are valuable in the sight of God, who hates evil, and to Him they are valuable chiefly as a sign. The death of Jesus on the cross has an infinite meaning and value, not because it is a death, but because it is the death of the Son of God. The cross of Christ says nothing of the power of suffering or death. It speaks only of the power of Him who overcame both suffering and death by rising from the grave. The wounds that evil stamped upon the flesh of Christ are to be worshipped as holy, not because they are wounds, but because they are his wounds. Nor would we worship them if he had merely died of them without rising again. For Jesus is not merely someone who once loved us enough to die for us. His love for us is the infinite love of God, which is stronger than all evil and cannot be touched by death. Suffering, therefore, can only be consecrated to God by one who believes that Jesus is not dead. And it is of the very essence of Christianity to face suffering and death, not because they are good, not because they have meaning, but because the resurrection of Jesus has robbed them of their meaning. The effect of suffering upon us depends on what we love. If we love only ourselves, suffering is merely hateful. It has to be avoided at all costs. It brings out all the evil that is in us, so that the one who loves only himself will commit any sin and inflict any evil on others merely in order to avoid suffering himself. If we love God and love others in him, we will be glad to let suffering destroy anything in us that God is pleased to let it destroy, because we know that all it destroys is unimportant. We will prefer to let the accidental trash of life be consumed by suffering in order that his glory may come out clean in everything we do. Christ is in us, his love, his passion in us. That is what we care about. We serve a God who understands what it is to suffer. He ended up alone, abandoned by his friends, ridiculed by almost everyone, betrayed, in physical pain and mental anguish, and displayed for all to see that a condemned criminal is hopeless and powerless. Does God know what it feels like to suffer? Absolutely. But Jesus' sufferings are redemptive, not just because he suffered them, but because he defeated them. And for those of us who know the crucified and risen Lord, it is possible to turn our sufferings over to him. We can allow God to show us what in our lives needs to be removed to glorify God. And we can ask God to use our sufferings to remove it. We can allow God to show us where we need to be sanctified and surrender our sufferings to God that we might be set apart. Our suffering can be made holy as God overcomes evil with good. This week, don't wallow in your suffering. Go to God with it, in prayer, through journaling, art, singing, or however you can or are best able. Ask God to redeem your suffering with the same power that raised Jesus from the grave. And if you want to share God's work of redemption, feel free to tell your story of the work of God to someone else this Easter. A pastor, spouse, friend, colleague, neighbor. As we suffer together, maybe we can all also be blessed by hearing of the work of God in one another's lives as we share God's redemption with each other. Have a very blessed Holy Week.